Welcome back, SPC listeners. We're coming today with a new Beyond the Checkride episode that's going to have you going places. Stick around for episode 84 of the Student Pilot Cast. Just go.
Chandler Tower, Cherokee 4121 Tango is at Chandler Air Service. We have Zulu, and we'd like a south departure, please.
One does it set to be an angel? Where does the sun go when it sleeps? I should by now. It isn't written.
All right, everyone. Turns out being a full-time flight instructor and working at a tech company as well doesn't leave a lot of time for editing podcasts. But after a short hiatus, we're back with another Beyond the Checkride episode. This one's probably been about 99% done for a while, so it was time to finally kick this one out of the nest. In this episode, Kent and I talk about some ideas about going places in airplanes. Probably one of the reasons many of us got into aviation in the first place. So enjoy this episode, and as usual, let us know what ideas you have about cross-country flying. Enjoy. All right, welcome back, everybody, to another Beyond the Checkride. We're glad you're with us. Kent, welcome back. How you been?
I am great. It's always a great day when you get to talk about flying.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And I think you've got a really cool topic today for us, Beyond the Checkride, about, something that's near and dear to my heart, going places. So what's the topic for today?
The topic for today is using GA for travel. And, I think it's near and dear to a lot of pilots' hearts because I think that a lot of people have this in mind when they become pilots. They think about how can I get around the country and the world to some extent easier and, have more freedom doing it, have a much better experience doing it. And so, I know that for me, it was all about higher, farther, faster when I first started learning how to fly. And that was because I wanted to go places. How about you?
Yeah, for sure. Going places was always part of what I wanted to do. Of course, since then, I've found fun in an airplane in a lot of different ways. Some of the most fun I've had is in light sport airplanes that weren't really good go places airplanes. But yes, that was always part of the dream and part of the reason to become a pilot, and still is. So I agree.
Yeah. And, right off the bat, you brought something up that I definitely want to cover, and that's what airplanes you can use to go places. And the real answer is any of them.
Any of them.
I agree. With an asterisk. I think the most uncomfortable cross-country flight I ever had was I flew from central Iowa to northern Arkansas in a Citabria. And it was an old Citabria with an old interior, and it was not comfortable. But it was a fun flight because I was at, 500 AGL pretty much the whole time and, scaring horses and whatnot. So it was definitely still a fun flight, but it was not the most comfortable flight. And that's not the airplane I would buy if I wanted to go places often.
Yep. And we've talked about this before. My son works for a company here locally that's got 8 extras that he helps kind of take care of. And that would be a hard plane to go places into. Lots of fuel stops and hard, no autopilot and hard to maintain, altitude heading. It's just, but
aerobatic airplanes
do it,
in general
are
not great for cross country because, of course, they're designed to not be stable. And why would you put an autopilot in one? I know that's a thing people do because they do still like to go places, and they also like to turn upside down. So there are some maybe more popular on something like the aerobatic Bonanza or the Marchetti or something like that. That's kind of a combination go places and fun airplane. But yeah, I remember years ago, I had a couple of friends, one of whom had previously owned a Pitts and one of whom owned a Pitts at the time and flew it across half the country to get to a fly-in that we were all at. And the guy who had it and had just hopped out after flying, I don't know, like 1,000 miles in the thing, asks the guy who used to have one, he says, "How do you fly a Pitts across the country?" And the other guy goes, "Are you effing nuts? You don't."
Yeah, exactly.
So yes,
Exactly.
that is an example of a plane that's not great, but I guess what we're really getting at more is right. I mean, but you mentioned the light sport, and part of why this subject came up for me is I've recently talked to several different people about flying GA cross country. And one of them is a guy who owned a 172 and I think maybe hadn't even thought about it. And there's nothing wrong with flying a 172 cross country. It's maybe
Very
not the
stable
best ship
airplane.
there is, but if it's what you got,
yeah,
you know, you don't have to have a speed demon to do it.
And so what if it takes you longer? That's more hours in the logbook.
Yep. Now, obviously,
flying.
there's a balance there, especially if you have a spouse who's with you or something like that. They may not want to sit in a little airplane for that long. So, if you're looking for what to buy, buy something that fits your missions as well as possible. But if you already have an airplane, even if it's not one that's super conducive to cross-country travel, I mean, there are people who fly from the West Coast into Oshkosh every year in airplanes that
absolutely.
In fact, one of the people that I love watching on YouTube, Zyla Foxland, she has, I think, a Luscombe that, she's based in LA and she flew it to Oshkosh this summer and posted a video about it. And it took her 4 days to get there, but you know what? She had a great time. So, and that's really what it's about. If you're really going to be, if you're really gung-ho to use GA for travel, there are lots and lots of great airplanes for travel via GA, but just because you don't have one doesn't mean that you shouldn't consider it. And we were kind of talking earlier that my friend with a 172, who I'm not sure if he even thought about taking it, when I kind of encouraged him to, it was because he was asking about renting an airplane at his destination so that he could take family members flying. And I went, you own a perfectly good airplane. If you thought about taking that, there were some other circumstances there too, led to him not taking his airplane. And given those, I would have agreed with that. But, there's nothing that says you can't take a 172 or a Luscombe or a light sport or whatever cross country as well. So
that's right.
But
and the light sport I have the most time in
definitely buy for it.
And the light sport I have the most time in had a great autopilot in it.
Yeah.
It would have been slow, but fine. The biggest problem with the light sport is you just can't take much stuff with you. That's people and things. So a lot of times when you're traveling, you want to take some stuff with you. So you got to make sure the airplane fits the mission. But I'm with you. Anything can look anywhere. Any airplane is a cross-country airplane if you got the time, right?
Yep. Yep. I'm trying to think. I mean, I know that from Wisconsin, mostly I have flown an Archer to Kentucky and Arkansas. And, I've flown the 182, fixed gear 182, literally all over the country, East Coast, West Coast, Gulf Coast. I think I landed that thing in somewhere between 30 and 35 states. So you don't need a speed demon to do this.
Yep.
So getting back to why you do it, well, it's part of the freedom that we have as pilots to be able to do that sort of thing, right? And airplanes are, with some exceptions, of course, like we said, they're great traveling machines. And I do like to tell people that flying is always an adventure. It just might not be the adventure you had planned on.
That's right.
But I consider myself extremely lucky in life to have had so many experiences in a small airplane that I just wouldn't trade for the world. And so part of the whole point of doing this episode is to encourage people to get out there and do it. Now, as pilots, we sometimes like to justify ourselves, right? And this is where, especially like I said, if you're going with a spouse or something like that, that might change how you calculate things. Or if you're going with small children, or, there are asterisks all over the place in this episode, but we're going to talk about some of those things and how you can do them successfully and have everybody have a good time. So one of the primary things that people talk about is cost. And generally, driving and flying the airlines are thought of as cheaper. There's a reason that is the thought process, and that is that often they are cheaper. But, just a little bit ago, we were talking about a leg that I flew in the Mooney from New Mexico to Wisconsin, and I actually burned less fuel flying the airplane than I would have driving the car.
Yeah, and you did that flight in less than 5 hours.
Yes.
Which is
I
pretty amazing.
definitely burned less fuel than the car would have burned at 200 miles an hour.
Yes.
So first of all, I would encourage those of you who feel the need to justify things via cost, look at all the costs, because GA does come out ahead sometimes. And especially if you're looking at kind of more of a mid-range trip, I would say, I guess the way I have put it once was anywhere from 150 miles to 2 times whatever the cruise speed times your cruise speed of your airplane times the endurance of your bladder. Where can you get in 2 legs? When you start having...
Hey, Kent, I got to say, I am just somehow not surprised that you have a rule of thumb for trip making like that. I love it.
Well, that one I don't actually
this,
use myself. I go wherever, but I know that some of those longer trips are harder to justify, especially for family members.
The only thing that would surprise me less right now is if you said, I also have a mnemonic for a trip. No, I'm just kidding.
But yeah, so the mid-range trips are the ones where GA really shines, especially if you're going someplace that is not an airline hub.
Yeah, because, cost is one thing, but there's a lot of cost savings and flexibility too. And I think you're probably going to talk about that, but having flexibility of time and place can bring with it a lot of cost savings that you need to take into account as well.
Yeah. A big one is hotel rooms. Since you mentioned flexibility, there are plenty of times where I can fly a leg or maybe 2 home after a day of having fun somewhere, and I saved myself a hotel room that night. I would have had to fly out in the airlines the next day, or I would have had to have one less day of fun or whatever I was doing at my destination. So, there's plenty of times where, in fact, I would say most times, airline flying kind of takes up your whole day. Whereas I've had work trips where I work the whole day and then fly home. And, we've had pleasure vacations where we're able to get some last minute play in and then hop in the airplane and get home and not need another hotel that night. And so definitely consider whether you're going to need another night or 2 in a hotel and how much that's going to cost you if you fly on the airlines.
Car things. Yeah.
And of course, the airlines love to charge fees for bags and, this and that and the other stuff. And of course, then there is also your time and your enjoyment of the trip. Being able to get somewhere faster is really nice. Not having to deal with the hassles of TSA. And one of the things that made me really start thinking about this hard very early on, I think it was the same summer I got my private. I went to my cousin's wedding, and I was already in Minneapolis for other reasons. Hopped on an airplane there, flew to Albuquerque. And of course, to get on the airplane, you have to go through all the regular airport stuff, parking and security and check-in and checking bags and all that. And, even though a lot of people don't travel with checked luggage anymore because of the fees, well, okay, so you didn't check it, but now they make you gate check it, and then you still have to wait at the other end and all that. So there's time involved in all of those things. And so, you have to consider that time. But then I got to the other end, and, takes a while to get off the airplane. And then I spent 45 minutes waiting for bags at baggage claim, spent another 45 minutes in line at the rental car counter, drove an hour and a half to a town that had a perfectly good GA airport. And I went, why did I just do this? I could have gotten myself here just as fast in an Archer. So
Yeah.
that was kind of an eye-opening moment for me to have that experience and go, okay, GA is really usable for travel, even if you don't have the fanciest, fastest airplane. So definitely consider all that time and, the difference in experiences between those as well. So if the actual numbers don't completely work out in your favor, consider that it might be worth a couple $100 to see some really cool sights and to not have somebody groping you in the TSA line.
Not to mention getting some great experience as a pilot.
Yes. And, cross-country flights are the best learning flying that you can have without an instructor aboard, I believe.
Agreed.
I really think that they're a great way to increase your skills as a pilot. To get out of the nest and see new terrain and deal with different controllers and all that. And I mean, the FAA has done a good job of designing the National Airspace System so that things are familiar in any place you go, but there's still enough that's different that it's, you always learn something when you go on a long trip. But
Yep.
you also you get to see new sights, and man, I cannot even begin to describe some of the amazing sights that I've been able to see from a small airplane.
Yeah. You're giving me chills.
Awesome. So as far as the cost for flying GA, fuel is the big one. You do need to look at fees. If you fly into Orlando International, which I have, you're going to pay some fees there. So be sure you call ahead to the FBO and at least, find out what those fees are and what you're in for. But there are, if you're an accountant, you might think, well, I need to amortize this and divide that across the hours and blah, blah, blah.
Engine rebuild and all of that. Yeah.
Here's how I look at it when I'm deciding whether or not I should financially be able to justify going somewhere in my airplane. I do not divide the entire cost by the number of hours in the year. If you do that, you'll never fly the airplane. And if you don't fly the airplane, why do you have the airplane? The way I look at it is the first hour I fly every year costs me somewhere between $12,000 and $28,000. I don't want to get any more accurate than that. And I'm sure that, everyone's costs are going to vary. East Coast hangars are really expensive, for example. And so, but anyway, the first hour you fly every year is horrendously expensive because, just the fact that you have an airplane, you're going to be paying for a hangar, you're going to be paying insurance, you're going to be paying for an annual inspection, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at it this way and say, okay, my first hour costs me 20 grand. All the other ones cost me,
gas
60. Right.
Yep.
Because really gas and, if you decide that you want to keep an engine reserve fund, you might want to consider that as well. But to me, the cost of travel is strictly the variable cost, the incremental cost of flying the airplane. Because just the decision you made to own an airplane is what cost you that first 20 grand or whatever it is. The more you fly it, the cheaper it is. And that's absolutely true. Airplanes love to fly. They get cheaper to maintain the more hours you put on them. And so by looking at it that way and being able to justify trips means that, my average per hour price goes down, just because I'm using the airplane more. So
Interesting.
I should have mentioned at the top here, just where I'm coming from now. It's been 21 years since I got my private, and I have used single engine piston airplanes to travel to around 40 states. I'll have to actually count them sometime and see if I've hit 40 yet. I know it's at least 35. Like I said, East Coast, West Coast, and Gulf Coast, being based here in the Midwest. And I have been to the Bahamas. So
Cool.
I have done lots of travel by GA. I know I have at least 2,400 hours of cross country time. So it's a thing I love to do, and I think everybody should give it a shot.
I couldn't agree more.
So now we talked about Beyond the Checkride and how this is a thing that I think a very high percentage of pilots want to do. And of course, the next thing is always, well, I have to get my instrument rating. I can't do that until I get my instrument rating. And yes, I have my instrument rating, and I've had it most of that time, but you do not have to have an instrument rating to fly cross country. You do need to have more weather flexibility if you don't have your instrument rating. There will be times where you get stuck at some little podunk place for, days potentially. That sort of thing doesn't tend to happen when you have an instrument rating, but that's also
Still
kind
an
of a horror
adventure.
story. Yeah, that's true.
Still an adventure, just maybe not the one you expected.
Yes, I know some guys who have a great story about driving hundreds of miles home in a U-Haul because it was the only thing they were available to rent in whatever little podunk town they ended up in. So yeah, you might have an adventure, but you'll definitely get a good story out of it. But even though I was going to say this is kind of a horror story that gets repeated throughout this industry that keeps people from using their airplanes. I mentioned flying to Kentucky in an Archer. I did that first fall that I had my private. So no instrument rating. I flew the 182 to Texas without an instrument rating. I went on a gigantic 5,800 nautical mile adventure over the course of 3 weeks, put 63 hours on that 182. I had the instrument rating for that, but since I was out west, like the whole point of it was to, see the sights. And so I was
took me
IFR
15
for
years to get my instrument after becoming a private pilot.
I think it took me 3 years.
Well,
those were 3
but
years.
Everybody knows you're smarter than me.
Cross-country flight in. Well, thank you, but I don't think so. But yeah, in those 3 years, like I said, I did some really good long cross countries without an instrument rating, and I did that huge West Coast adventure, like I said, with an instrument rating, but I was IFR for maybe 20 minutes of that entire trip. And it was certainly, the situation that led to me being IFR. If I had waited maybe 2 hours, the weather would have been through. So,
all right, I'm gonna take a slight tangent here,
okay.
And I'm just gonna ask you what's hopefully a quick question. If you are traveling somewhere and the weather's okay, do you file IFR or do you fly VFR?
Wow, that is a big old it depends. That's the answer to every question in aviation. It depends.
Good point.
There are so many variables involved. And it really does. Yeah, I've done plenty of both. Especially out west, I love being VFR, and it's conducive to VFR when you're in the mountains because the air is pretty dry and there's rarely a whole lot of clouds, and when there are clouds,
not a lot of haze.
You might not want to be flying IFR either.
Right, exactly.
You have a lot more limited options when you're out that way IFR, and of course, if you make a mistake, the consequences can be a lot more severe. Well, I do want to talk about the flip side, and that is when I would go IFR, even if the weather is fine. And usually that's for operational reasons. Like, if you're going somewhere in the Washington, D.C. area, I feel like it's a lot easier to fly there IFR. Things are generally the same. I believe you still have to take the CIFRA familiarization course and learn about all the ways that they're going to shoot you down and all the ways that they're going to warn you that they're going to shoot you down if you go in the wrong place out there. And of course, what the procedures are so that they don't shoot you down. But really, the key there is that the easiest thing to do if you're not familiar with those procedures and, because you're based far away, is just file IFR and, make sure you stay IFR all the way to the ground and you pick up IFR before you get off the ground, and then pretty much nothing's different. So that sort of situation is one example. The other one is like if you're flying into a primary class Bravo airport or any other sort of really, really busy airport, it's just a lot easier because they know you're coming. They know how to deal with you. One of my flight instructors had an incident where he was trying to fly VFR into Chicago O'Hare because he was taking some charter pilots to pick up an airplane that had been left there. And the controllers at O'Hare at the time literally had no idea how to work him, because O'Hare, they've gotten so much better, but they used to be so, I hate to say anti-GA, but they really were.
121 focused.
Right. Yeah. Right. All 121 all the time. Right. And so he ended up circling outside the Bravo, and I think he had to call on 6 different frequencies before someone finally got on the phone and called the controller that he needed to call and said, tell them this, this is how you work a VFR aircraft, because, they just weren't used to it at all. So it goes a lot smoother when you're tangling with, a whole bunch of jets if you just operate the way they do, learn how to fly a fast approach, file IFR, and then just go on in. And I generally don't go places like that on purpose.
Right.
I tend to avoid Bravos because they're expensive and, there's a lot of traffic to deal with.
Busy and it takes a long time. The
one
gas
of
is
the
expensive.
Time advantages that we have with GA is being able to land closer to our actual destination. So it's rare that I fly GA into a primary Bravo, but I've flown into Baltimore, Washington International several times. I've flown into Orlando International, New Orleans, and a few others. I'd have to sit down and figure out the whole list, but that's a situation where I would probably file IFR.
Yep. Okay.
So I think we pretty well beat that question to death. There are no short questions when you're asking me, right? So, one of the notes that I put in here for the show on IFR versus VFR was just, do you have to be IFR? No. Go ahead, fly those long cross countries VFR. Just have that extra flexibility so that you can make good decisions. Is it helpful to have an instrument rating? Absolutely. There's plenty of times where, there's a overcast layer at 1,000, 1,500 feet, something like that, and it's only 500 or 1,000 feet thick, and it's going to keep VFR pilots sitting on the ground for, like I said, potentially a couple of days. Whereas if you're an IFR pilot, you just blast up through it and you're on your way. So I would say if traveling is going to be a goal, then the instrument rating should be a goal, but not a requirement. And I do have some friends who have flown all over the country for years and years and never got their instrument ratings. So definitely don't let the lack of an instrument rating be something that stops you from trying it. One little, oh boy, here we go again. I have another rule of thumb that's related to all this. Basically, it's the 1,110 rule. And that is that if you're going on a 1,000-mile trip and you have to go 100 miles off course in the middle, it only actually adds about 10 miles to the
Yeah.
trip distance.
Something that blows people's minds, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just, if nothing else, it's a reminder to keep flexibility in mind. You don't have to go direct from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Houston. You
Yep.
can go well off course in the middle and really not affect the length of the trip significantly at all. And so, you have a luxury on the longer trips of being able to say, I don't really like that weather there, so I'm going to go over that way and go around it. And hey, as a bonus, if that's a trip you've done before, now you get to see new stuff.
Yeah, it also gives you flexibility to find cheaper fuel for your fuel stops. Yeah.
So that kind of leads us into planning and how we do that. Specifically, I would say the process I follow is to, look at my departure and destination airports. My departure is where I'm based. My destination is almost always going to be the closest paved runway to the actual spot I'm trying to go. I don't try to avoid grass runways. I just don't find a whole lot of them in the places that I'm actually trying to go. They tend to be
and in
more
good
rural
condition. Yeah,
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just if you think about where they are in relation to population centers, which are, the more population a place has, the more likely you're going to be to go there. Not that I'm going to New York City on every trip or anything like that, but if I'm going to visit friends or relatives, unless they're living on a farm in the middle of nowhere, they're living near other people. And so it's
And
very
even
frequent.
then, there's probably a paved runway close by.
Right. It would be interesting to know how many counties in the U.S. don't have a paved runway anywhere.
Most do.
As I don't want to say unhealthy, but maybe as malnourished as GA is, there are still lots and lots of airports in this country. And, I'm very thankful for that. So yeah, generally that's going to be where I'm going, is the nearest paved runway, unless there's some reason to go somewhere else nearby. But I'm always aiming to get as close as I can to my destination. In between, boy, you have a million options. And so the first thing I do usually is I start looking at, okay, how many stops am I going to need or want? And then I start working from there. I also am going to be looking at, is there any terrain I want to go around, or is there anything I want to see that might be a little ways off course? So I guess before the stops, I probably do those two things and kind of decide what I want my overall course for the entire trip to be. And then start looking at, okay, where am I going to fuel the plane? Where am I going to fuel myself? I would say that often we will just pack sandwiches and snacks and stuff like that in the airplane when we go somewhere. But if you're going on a longer trip where you're going to need more than one meal along the way, you probably are going to want to be able to stop someplace where there's a convenient way to get some food, either on the airport or real close to it. If I'm really going far away, or if maybe, we're working and then leaving on the same day and we're leaving in the evening, I'm going to stay overnight somewhere. I kind of like to figure out those overnight stops. So, I figure out that overall course and then the stops, and then I do it all over again. So that was plan A. And I would say normally I want to have maybe 3 plans, column A, B, and C. You might want to look at, okay, if I'm going off course 100 miles in the middle this way or 100 miles in the middle that way for weather, what would that look like? Is there a different way around some of that terrain that I might want to try out, or something different I might want to see along the way? Look at some of those same things, but on a completely different route that's significantly different, just so that you have some options if the weather, one or two of those routes, turns out to be bad when you depart.
Yeah, we have to stop and see the world's largest rubber band ball. We just have to.
Oh, now I'm going to have to think about after we're done recording this episode, what's the weirdest thing I've seen? I mean, I have seen, like I said, many cool things. And I want to point out that even after your A, B, and C, to be as safe as possible on a cross-country trip, you have to be willing to throw all your plans away and come up with a completely new one at the last minute while you're already flying sometimes.
Including turning around and 86 in the whole thing. It's got to be in your bag of tricks.
Yep. There have to be those times where, and this will happen in the middle of the trip, just filled up with fuel, and I think the weather is going to be okay up ahead this way. And, well, you take off and you kind of look around and you just go, nope.
Nope.
Turn around, get on the ground, sit it out for a while. There are, lots of horror stories that people talk about, but honestly, I've never, pretty sure I have never had to make an unplanned overnight.
I have.
Yeah. And, lots of people have, but
but it was a great time.
Yeah.
I mean, we
always
still had a great time. Yeah.
But as many horror stories as people will tell about how awful GA is for travel, I've actually found it to be highly reliable. Not 100%. Yeah. Nothing is 100%. And, you need to be okay with that. You need to be okay with some schedule flexibility and all that sort of thing. But it should definitely not stop you from doing anything, or at least planning to. So anyway, come up with 3 big overall plans, at least down to the leg level. And then, kind of go from there. Be willing to throw them out the window if you need to. But
that flexibility you're talking about, I think is it, it's a safety feature. And
absolutely.
I think, we have to, we talk about, get their-itis and things. We have to be willing to be flexible and throw out our plans all the time if we want to stay safe.
Yeah. And we'll get to that in a little bit when we talk about more of the safety aspects of this. But planning wise, I think having three main routes is a good thing to do. And then finally, once you figure out which of those routes you're going to fly, then you're probably going to want to get in your EFB and split them into separate legs and plan each leg individually with, approach and departure procedures and that sort of thing. Get in a little more detail and plan out each leg the way that you normally would.
It's kind of fun to do that anyway.
It is. I mean, it's a good exercise. I really enjoy planning flights, and I've probably planned at least 10 flights for every flight I've ever taken. Sometimes it's just fun to dream, and especially if you just blew all your money on one trip and you can't take another one for a little bit, figure out what that next one is going to be and start fantasy planning.
I've planned at least 10 times more flights than I've ever taken, for sure.
Yeah.
And I've got flights saved in ForeFlight that I have never taken and may never take, but I've got them in there because I wanted to see what it would be like to do that flight.
Yep. I have a plan for an Atlantic crossing that has been sitting in my ForeFlight for at least a decade.
That's a doozy.
It is. Well, hopefully someday I'll be able to afford that.
That's way beyond the Checkride.
Yes. That's potentially beyond sanity, but so let's talk a little bit about some of those safety things. And like you mentioned, flexibility is to me the most important way of staying safe. If you are a person who absolutely has to adhere to plan A, don't travel by GA.
Buy an airplane ticket.
Yep. And there will be times where that's your plan B, even if you are planning to fly yourself. Get there-itis is a big deal. There's a reason
it's a killer.
It has a name.
Yeah.
And so What I generally like to do to avoid that is to plan to leave early enough that if there's a place that I have to be at a specific time, I just leave early enough in the airplane where, let's say I go to the airport, the airplane fails its mag check, and I'm not flying anywhere. I want to be able to just get in the car and drive if I have to. So sometimes that means, you're going to be leaving a day early.
Yeah.
And what that means is that 99% of the time, you get an extra day of vacation at your destination, But the 1% of the time, you're at least still safe.
Yep.
So that's a big thing. It's just the schedule flexibility. It gives you the time to fly around weather systems instead of through them. It's just, to me, it's the most important aspect of staying safe when you're trying to travel by GA is flexibility. The bonus, again, is you get to your destination early and you get home early. If it happens to not work out that way, oh well, at least you're still safe and you still got to where you were going. But that Southwest, I can't remember what they call it, but not the cheapest ticket, but the more expensive Southwest tickets that are refundable.
Business Select.
There you go.
Right.
And they let you board first
and
and get the best seats. But you can cancel them for a full refund. Obviously, don't quote me on this. Don't depend on it. But my experience is that you can cancel them for a full refund right up until departure time. And so
that's a great point. That's a safety feature right there. Like have an alternate plan that doesn't cost you money if you don't need it.
Yep.
That's a great idea.
So in the process of being flexible, like we've both already alluded to, you can have some great adventures. Like I said, it's always an adventure, just not necessarily the one you had planned on.
That's right.
I mean, there are times where you will plan to go somewhere that's neat and fun, and there are times where you will just discover it completely by accident. One of our favorite stops now is one that I discovered completely by accident on a trip out to see my brother in the Pacific Northwest. I just decided, I want to stop and buy some fuel. Landed at Granite Falls, Minnesota. And, there's not a whole lot out there. It's nowhere close to the cities. But I fly in, and right behind me, there's this warbird that enters the pattern and lands and pulls up to the hangar. And, I only landed there because they had cheap fuel. Having no idea what else might be at this airport. And this warbird comes in behind me and taxis up, and this hangar opens. And I kind of look over there and, there's several really, really nice hangars here. And it's all a museum. And it's called Fagan Fighters. Absolutely wonderful museum. One thing that they do that I have not seen anywhere else is that they actually paint the inside walls of the hangars so that you'll see, okay, here's this airplane that's sitting on the floor of the hangar, and there'll be a painting of it up on the wall in battle. And they even have, there are paratroopers coming down, and there are some of them actually, they'll have half of a mannequin sticking out of the wall. So it's a little bit amazing. More 3D. Yeah, it's really cool. They did a great job. But one of the things that really caught my eye there was they have a Waco CG-4A glider, which is one of those troop transport gliders that was pulled by a DC-3 and dropped behind enemy lines on the night before D-Day. And
right.
There are not very many of those left because, the Germans knew they were coming and put up all kinds of obstacles to them. And of course, glider flying at night is pretty dangerous to begin with. And even the ones that were used during the day, that they had to be able to find a good landing site. And I'm not sure they ever actually retrieved any of the ones that were used
Probably
operationally,
not.
Because that's, I mean, obviously picking up a glider from a field is a challenge when it's that big. I think they carried something like 20 or 25 troops on every one. So they're fairly sizable. And that's the only one of those gliders I've ever seen anywhere. So that kind of blew me away. But the other thing that they have there is a control tower. It's like a period control tower, and you can climb up the
wow.
stairs to the top, and they have period radios with manuals and everything in this control tower. So you can go up there and check all that out and look out over the airfield while you're at it.
And you found this just completely by accident. That's pretty amazing.
Completely by accident. So, and now, yeah, every time we go to the West Coast, we stop there on the way, get some fuel and check out the museum for a couple hours. And it just makes a great way to take a break for the family. And, kids quit complaining for a while after that. Are we there yet? I actually don't have that problem in the airplane most of the time, but it's a good break for everybody. The other one I like to talk about is, and this was something I couldn't plan for at all. This was one of those throw out all the plans situations. We were in Western Montana, and did I talk about this one on the podcast already with the puking son?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
All right. Well, so we were on the way out to the West Coast, and we're over the mountains in Western Montana, and it's bumpy. It's kind of late afternoon. I think we were aiming for Idaho Falls for that night. So, just kind of the late afternoon turbulence, plus, probably some mechanical turbulence from the terrain as well.
A lot of mountains around there.
Just really bumpy. And my wife had downloaded some things to her phone for my son to watch as we were flying along, just in case he got bored. And so he's sitting there with this little screen in front of him, bouncing all over the place, and completely without warning, he just hurls all over himself. Like, oh, okay, time for a new plan. So because we were in the mountains, there weren't any airports that were like right there, but like 20 miles in front of us, there was an airport, and, landed there completely unplanned. Hadn't looked at any airport information before we got there or anything like that. And so we land to get the kid in the car seat cleaned up. And luckily it all stayed in the car seat. We didn't have anything to clean up in the airplane. And while we're doing that, I see this guy walking around and getting ready to go flying in his airplane. And I don't know. He caught my eye for some reason. It's kind of hard to explain. My sister works for NASA. So I've been lucky enough to meet quite a few astronauts. And this guy, let's just say he was wearing some stuff that I was pretty sure hadn't come from the gift shop.
Did he possibly have the right stuff?
That was awful, but yes.
I could not resist.
He was wearing something that had a NASA logo on it, and I'm like, yeah, that doesn't look like gift shop merch to me. That looks like actual, this is the official mission patch sweatshirt or something like that. And I honestly can't even remember exactly what it was, but I kind of went, yeah, that's not normal. And so I just kind of said, hey, are you an astronaut? And he said, yeah. So I'm like, oh, that's cool. And, my sister works for NASA. And because my sister does work directly with the astronauts, they actually knew each other. So,
oh, wow. Amazing.
Yeah. Nice little small world moment. So we got to talk for a little while, and then, he flew off, went his way, and I went my way. And we're still friends on Facebook. And he's like most astronauts are, super, super interesting guy. And so, these are just some of the
encounter,
right? These are just some of the random experiences that you can have on a long cross country trip when you end up throwing your plans out the window. So absolutely is always an adventure. So don't be afraid to throw those plans out the window, because honestly, sometimes it seems like things are more fun that way.
I agree. Yeah.
And all of that, just knowing all that is a big help to keeping that attitude about flexibility that keeps you safe. So if you're new to this and you haven't been able to have that experience yet, absolutely don't be afraid to be flexible. Throw your plans out, and just, be willing to experience what comes to you, because I've had so many cool adventures that way. And I guess the
Get
other
out there and go places.
yes. And kind of the last thing on this vein, safety on these long trips is, recognize in your planning, and this is part of the reason for doing the detailed planning, recognize when things are going to be a little bit on the edge. Every pilot should know their own personal envelope. And we're going to talk about this in an upcoming episode too, how to expand that personal envelope a little bit. But you kind of have an idea when things are going to be on the edge. And you should think about and visualize beforehand what could go wrong. What happens if I have more of a headwind and I'm not going to make that fuel stop that I had planned on? Out west, there's not that many airports. And so, you might have to fly a long way to get to a different one. And you'll have to obviously recognize that situation early in the case of fuel. I actually had a situation on my last trip to the Northwest. I was in Minnesota, went to my first fuel stop. Pump was busted. Oh, crap. Go to the second fuel stop. Credit card machine was busted.
Oh, my goodness.
So, these things do happen. You need to be prepared for it. And so if you're planning to get all the way down to day VFR fuel reserves, don't.
Yeah.
So, make sure you're not getting too close to those edges of the envelope for either you or the aircraft. The other thing is that I would say try to make as many decisions early, if they're going to be tough decisions, as you can.
Great advice.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens pretty frequently with get there-itis, it's the worst kind of get there-itis, is get home-itis. There was actually a fatal accident here a number of years ago that was a get home-itis thing. And it was a guy who was trying to get home on Sunday night, and get back to work the next morning or whatever. So he had that pressure there. And of course, you always want to be home instead of in a hotel, right? Well, he was running low on fuel and ran into one of those situations where, for whatever reason, he could not pump fuel, and he just flat out did not have enough to get to another airport. He actually used, I don't know what kind of container he used, but he had some sort of a container. He sumped fuel out of the tanks of an airplane that was parked there, and then just left them a note and said, "Hey, I took some of your fuel. Give me a call here and I'll pay you for it." But unfortunately, that was not able to happen because he apparently still didn't take enough, thought he had enough, tried to get home, ran out of gas at night, crashed into some trees and died. Don't be that guy. Think about, again, those things that are kind of on the edge. What's going to happen if I get to a half hour away from home and my fuel reserves are a little bit low? Well, every one of us, if we are honest with ourselves, are going to want to push ahead anyway.
Yep.
We also know that there are a million reports in the NTSB files that we have looked at and gone, why did that guy make such an idiotic mistake as to run out of fuel 5 minutes from home? So think about that stuff in advance and make the decisions in advance as well. The example I want to give here was actually
when you're in the thick of it, right?
Yes, because that's when you make the wrong decision.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
And so the story I'm going to tell here was actually a commercial flight, not airline, but one that I flew. And it was one of these ones where it was kind of bordering on the range of the airplane at the weight we were flying. We had the seats full, so we couldn't take full fuel. And it was a situation where there was forecast to be an increasing headwind the further we went toward the destination. So there's kind of strike two right there. And then, of course, it was the bigwigs from our biggest client. you know, and so, there's going to be that passenger pressure. They want to get there without that fuel stop if they can help it. And so I went, okay, we are not going to make this decision in the airplane because we know that our passengers are going to want us to push on. We know that we're going to want to push on. I mean, how would it look if you're flying some clients somewhere and you have to stop 20 miles away from your destination to fuel up?
Right.
They're not going to like that at all.
So stop in the middle instead.
Right. Well, and that's the thing is you got to think of that stuff in advance.
That's right.
What is it going to feel like when I am in this situation that I think could happen because I'm a little closer to the edge of the envelope than I would like to be? And so the plan I came up with was, okay, here's an airport that's halfway there. I know has decent facilities. And actually, the airport was more like 3/4 of the way there. But halfway there was a waypoint on the flight plan. I went, okay, when we hit this waypoint, we are going to evaluate the situation. And here is the minimum number of gallons I will accept on board at this time to not do the fuel stop. If we don't have that number of gallons, automatically we're going to that fuel stop. And then I made a second one where, okay, when we're beam that first one, we're going to evaluate again. And we're going to need this many gallons to continue. And this is where we're going to go if we don't have enough. And so by making those plans in advance and making the situation a little bit more black and white and being able to take all the emotion out of it because that emotion doesn't exist yet when you made the decision makes it a piece of cake. And then we flew the flight, got to that first waypoint, went, okay, looks good to me. Do you agree? Yes. Okay. We're going to continue to the next one, make that decision again. And we were able to make the flight without a fuel stop, but we were able to do it safely because we had done that decision making in advance. So try and think through some of those possible scenarios that you might run into and go through that decision making in advance, and you'll be able to keep yourself a lot safer that way. And I think if you do all of that, you're going to have a safe trip. You're going to have a great trip. You're going to learn things. You're going to get great use out of your airplane, and you're going to have a whole lot of fun. You gain valuable experience, and you're going to want to do it again. So,
yep, over and over again. Spend that time flying.
Absolutely.
I love it. Well, thanks, Kent. Awesome things to be thinking about. I know I learned a few things here. And so you guys out there listening and watching, we love that you're here. Reach out to us. Let us know your stories, your thoughts. You can reach us at the contact page on studentpilotcast.com, or you can send an email to bill@studentpilotcast.com. Either way, it'll get to us. And we just want to hear about, your travel stories and things that you've learned and the things you would add to the listing of things that we've talked about here today. So appreciate that. And Kent, thanks again. Great topic, great stuff. And we'll catch you next time.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
All right. We'll see you.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed taking things a little bit beyond the check ride. Let us know your thoughts, and as usual, you can reach us at the website at studentpilotcast.com on the contact page, or via email at either Bill or Kent at studentpilotcast.com. I can be found on X as well at BillWill. That's Bravo India Lima Lima Whiskey India Lima. Thanks again for hanging out with us, and keep in mind there's always ways to expand our comfort zone in aviation. And if it's just taking trips, that's one of the areas that you want to expand your own experience in. Just get out there and do it. Safely, of course.
music for today's episode is To Be an Angel by the Canadian band Uncle Seth. You can get more information and subscribe to the podcast feeds on the web at studentpilotcast.com. Remember, any instruction that you hear in this podcast was meant for me and for me alone in the situation I was in at the time. Please do not try to blindly apply anything you see or hear in this podcast to your own flying without thinking it through on your own completely. If you have questions about any aspect of your flying, please consult a qualified CFI.